I've not been asked to speak either for or against. I've been given a very specific brief, which is to talk about the legislative process, the particular role of bishops in the House of Lords with regard to that process, and in particular as it relates to this subject of assisted suicide. As you've heard, I served in the House of Lords as a Lord Spiritual for 9 years until my retirement in 2013. I held a brief for speaking on beginning and end-of-life medical ethics, and as such, I was a member of the all-party group on parliamentary group on dying well. Now, my view is that within the legislative process, bishops and the Lords have three very clear responsibilities. The first is, along with their peers, to assist all members of the House to make good law and to avoid poor legislation. The second is to be aware of the impact of their own contribution to debate on others, particularly the many members of the House of Lords who struggle to articulate the application of their faith to public life. Bishops have a responsibility to speak into that duty and to do so with a greater understanding of what that faith involves. And thirdly, it is to see that their contributions are distinct from others in the House, that they come involving important elements of apologetic, what we might term public theology, or, if you like, a theologically informed anthropology. So let me begin with a reflection on A, the role of law, and B, what makes for good law rather than bad. The late Bishop John Robertson argued that the primary function of law in society is not to prohibit but to protect, not to enforce morals but to safeguard persons, their privacies and their freedoms. And where there is no need for protection, it should not intervene. Its aim should be to maximize the area of freedom and moral responsibility, and then to have good and enforceable ring fences to protect persons against exploitation. Now, that's a very good point from which to start, but it also begs a number of questions, and it highlights a number of tensions. They are tensions which are illustrative of what John Hare calls, in his book with this title, the moral gap. The moral gap referred to here is the distance between the moral demands on us and our abilities to fulfill its commands. Without some ways of filling the gap, we will necessarily fail in our pursuit of morality, and the obligation and motivation to morality will disintegrate. The gap may be perceived in a number of different ways. So, first, there is the gap between theoretical and actual moral communities. Thus, Alistair MacIntyre in After Virtue wrote, "In spite of 3 centuries of moral philosophy and 1 of sociology, we still lack any coherently, rationally defensible statement of a liberal individualistic point of view, i.e., one that enables us to resolve specific moral dilemmas such as abortion, transgendering, or assisted suicide." He argues that a prerequisite for what he terms, following Aristotle, virtue, is the formation of moral communities, communities of shared value. The reality of our political or legislative life, though, is that it must serve a society in which it is now almost impossible for the values of any one moral community to gain anything like universal acceptance. Rather, politics and legislation must respond to and seek to comprehend a series of fragmented communities, each bringing their own virtues to modern medicine, but without any expectation that everyone could accept them all. Here is the first gap, a reality gap, and one that can only be bridged by a meta-narrative, that is, some overarching account of the human condition that coheres with the totality of human life and experience. Now, whilst noting that the Christian theological tradition offers precisely this, when it comes to the making of law, it is always requisite to seek to frame legislation in such a way that in default of such an overarching narrative, it is still likely to garner general acquiescence and respect, consciously seeking to maximize both protection and freedom, rights and responsibilities within a framework that is recognizably for the common good. This then brings me to the second gap, the gap that Hare describes. It's one between what he calls personal resonance and a shared cosmic order of meanings. Now, put simply, I take this to mean that even the words we use in common are actually used with different meanings as they resonate with our personal and particular values and understandings. So take, for example, the word health. Narrowly conceived by some as the absence of disease, a term itself very much given to cultural variance. For others, it is concerned with well-being, a term with meta-ethical variance. For others, with holistic physical, mental, and spiritual health, now with metaphysical variance. Similarly, words such as dying, suffering, terminal, unbearable, dignity, right, compassion do not carry self-evidently agreed meanings. Each has a personal resonance to individual circumstances, but each will inevitably shape cosmic or civic order when it is given the sanction of law. And then any understanding given the sanction of law will shape the future use of the term and its implications for praxis. So again, another responsibility for legislators is a forensic consideration of how words are used and what the maybe unforeseen consequences of such a use might be. Then thirdly, back to Hare, the evident gap that exists between community moral demands and a human propensity to selfishness. To quote Kant, humans have an original disposition to the good, overlaid with an innate but immutable propensity to do evil. Therefore, Kant argued, an ought must imply a can. If it is not the case that people can live by a moral demand, then it cannot be the case that they ought to do so. Now, common ways of seeking to narrow this gap, he suggests, are by either A, lowering the threshold of the moral demand, or B, by exaggerating human propensity to behave altruistically for the common good. However, neither approach is likely to make for good law. For either the law will be increasingly ignored, which is perhaps why we have the current debate around our subject at the present time, or its provisions will be abused, hence the importance of getting the detail of legislation right and not just the headlines. Now, all this suggests to me that the Lord's spiritual and others, speaking from a perspective of faith, do have a real and decisive and distinctive contribution to make to the legislative process. At which point, let me just remind you what in the House of Lords this process involves. First of all, there is a first reading, a formality where the name of the bill is read. The second reading, the main debate on the purpose and key areas of the bill, and the point where speeches are made about the general principles of the bill, its purpose, its desirability, and concerns about its application and impact. It was the Commons equivalent to that which took place last Friday. Next, the committee stage, which involves line-by-line scrutiny of the text with amendments, working systematically through the bill from beginning to end with votes on proposed changes, and finally a report stage, which offers another opportunity to examine the bill and make changes in the light of responses received. Now, it's these two stages, committee and report, that I want to consider here. For this is where the forensic consideration is needed and a difference is made between good law and bad. And I remind you again that it is these two parallel stages in the Commons that the bill, which has been given its second reading, is about now to proceed to. Speeches on general principle for or against and detailed scrutiny of proposed legislation ought responsibly to go hand in hand. In particular, any bishop speaking on the principles involved in a bill concerning assisted suicide should also feel a moral and pastoral responsibility to give equal attention and commitment of time and intellectual rigor to the detail of what is being proposed, not just to its general intent. And I would expect the kind of general principles that I have already mentioned to inform how they do so. Now, during my time in the Lords, 2 attempts were made to take forward legislation to allow physician-assisted suicide. For that is what we're talking about here, not the wider issue of dying well or how people are assisted to die well. In both those former occasions, I felt a responsibility to speak both on general principles, addressing the broad ethical, philosophical, and theological assumptions and implications of the bill's intention and proposed operation. But the consequence of this for me was to ensure that further interventions were made at a committee and revision stage relating to the nature of the law itself as law and the principles on which good law is based and bad law is to be rejected. At both stages, too, I felt that my intervention should be grounded in what I might call a clear theological anthropology, not referred to explicitly in debate, but capable of being appealed to when required, and with a pastoral concern for other members of the House also seeking to bring their faith to bear on a complex subject and for whom contributions from our bench would have a didactic or apologetic impact for good or for ill. So, with this as a starting point, were I a member of the House of Lords now, some of the questions that I would wish to raise at the stage of committee scrutiny would include these, and the order in which I raise them suggests no necessary hierarchy of importance or impact. So, to begin, it appears that any legislation will attempt to limit any provision for physician-assisted suicide to those with a terminal illness. But this begs the question of how terminal is to be defined, under the implications of any definition for other areas of law where the term might be applied. For example, the area of benefits and social care. Currently, people are accorded additional benefits if they have been certified as terminally ill, with terminal being defined as unlikely to survive for 6 months after receiving a terminal diagnosis. But since that definition was enshrined in law in 1990, advances in treatment and diagnosis mean that many more people are living with, quote, terminal illness for longer, and there has been an increasing recognition that life expectancy cannot be so accurately predicted. It is, in fact, very challenging for clinicians to estimate precisely how long someone has left to live. So, in 2018, the Scottish Parliament, following medical advice, removed any explicit time limit from the equivalent laws in Scotland. And at Westminster, the all-party parliamentary group report concluded that the assumption that people with terminal illnesses will need support only for a matter of months until they die is outdated and does not reflect the modern reality of many terminal conditions, where people can live and need ongoing support for several years with conditions that cause progressive debility over time. The current legal definition of terminal illness, with its 6-month rule, is, and I quote, unfit for purpose. It is outdated, arbitrary, and not based on any clinical reality. It went on to recommend that the UK government amend the definition of terminal illness in the UK law, saying, and I quote, "We want people to have a better end-of-life experience, keeping their quality of life as high as possible for as long as possible. People who have an incurable illness that will eventually end their life should have ready access to the benefits they need, unquote. There are important questions about how any legislation to permit assisted suicide would cohere with and not subvert other areas of law relating to end-of-life provision and care, and with a definition already regarded as unfit for purpose, what the direction of travel in legal interpretation is likely to be. Then, in that debate on benefits for the terminally ill, further submissions from the medical profession also noted that clinicians' interpretations of the law also may vary significantly. And many clinicians believe that they will be held accountable if their prediction turns out to be wrong. Evidence from the Royal College of General Practitioners warned that, quote, doctors may be concerned that a patient's state of mind will be negatively impacted upon hearing their life expectancy may only be 6 months, even if this is only a reasonable expectation. For this reason, GPs may be reluctant to specify a timescale, especially when they know there is considerable uncertainty. This then leads to another crucial matter in legislative drafting. What about those with suicidal feelings? In normal circumstances, a GP would respond to someone with suicidal feelings with a variety of therapeutic interventions, e.g., a referring to talking therapies, the prescription of medication, a reference to specialist services such as community mental health teams. A law permitting physician-assisted suicide could lead to the absurdity of assuming that just because a person has a terminal illness, they cannot, by definition, be suicidal. There is a danger of requiring doctors to treat someone who says that they wish to end their life in a radically different way just because they have a terminal illness. This is not person-centered. It is not responding to someone as a whole person. There is a further danger of a bias against the older, the less articulate, and any who are vulnerable to pressure from others. A consequence is a difficulty in defining and discerning responsible choice, and so limiting serious deliberation about what would warrant assisting someone to end their life, rather than trying to prevent suicide. This brings me on to implications for the medical profession. No one is suggesting, currently, and rightly so, that a physician must agree to a request to assist a person to take their life in such circumstances as may be defined by law. Freedom of conscience and professional reticence must be respected. But where this is the case, as for example in Oregon or the Netherlands, it is striking how few doctors are prepared to participate in this activity, particularly where physician-assisted suicide, where the physician prescribes but the patient self-administers, becomes augmented by clinician-administered medical assistance in dying, where a physician or nurse practitioner is also permitted to administer the legal dose. Now, in Canada, where that is allowed, in 2022, 13,241 such clinician-administered interventions were recorded, accounting for 4.1% of all deaths nationwide. Figures I have seen put the percentage of doctors prepared to actively intervene in this way, though, as low as 2%. When such small numbers are involved, there are real questions of the availability and effectiveness of procedures for monitoring and review, and the danger of creating a small medical subculture which may become hermetically sealed and immune to an ongoing forensic, ethical, and medical evaluation. Two physicians and a judge may sound like a robust safeguard, but it begs huge questions about qualifications, practice, oversight, and review. An all-important precautionary principle would suggest that a multi-professional socio-legal model outside of healthcare should be considered, with an assessment not only of the patient, but also of the care and support available to them or being denied them, together with that of their carers, their families, and those closest to them, and also the pressures experienced by and exerted on them. Any legislative provision in this respect needs to be safe for individual patients and general healthcare provision, whilst also providing the transparency of operation, monitoring, and accountability necessary for public trust and respect. Now, at this point, objections may then begin to be raised about the cost of such a model, but this must then also lead to a consideration of the cost and effectiveness of other ways of addressing the presenting issue, even beyond the ethical and strictly legal. Here may be the one thing around which both proponents and opponents of the proposed legislation might coalesce, is that of the goal of achieving dignity in dying. Currently, more than 100,000 people per annum in the UK cannot access the specialist palliative care that those providing their medical care believe they need. No one piece of legislation exists in a vacuum, and it is right and proper to consider its impact on other areas of government activity, not least in the allocation of resources. It is therefore not surprising that as part of this debate, there are also calls for increased resource for more widespread palliative care to be considered as the greater priority, particularly when the evidence is that where physician-assisted suicide is permitted by law, the extent and quality of palliative medical care has, even if not diminished, failed to increase. Now, assisted suicide is a hugely emotive subject, and many personal experiences trigger well-publicized and heart-wrenching demands for the law to be changed. But what might appear best for individuals might not be best for society. We are by nature social animals with an interconnectedness that is real, even when not fully recognized. A former chair of NICE, the National Institute for Healthcare and Excellence, recently spoke of frequently being asked how he copes with heading an organization that sometimes denies treatment for NHS patients, often with the question, but what if it were one of your family? His answer was that if one of his family were ill, he would, of course, want there to be no limit to the cost of keeping them alive. But he also understood that what might seem best for an individual might not be best for society as a whole. Every pound can only be spent once, and aspiring to help individuals may well harm the care offered to others. The same caveat, albeit with different things to be weighed in the balance, applies to assisted suicide. From an individual perspective, this might seem to a logical and loving development. From the perspective of society, it may have a profoundly different outcome, with a legion of unintended consequences, ranging from the impact on trust in the medical profession, the medical profession's own self-understanding, the use of resources, the implications for palliative care, and the response to a range of mental health issues such as suicidal thoughts and a propensity to self-harm. And not least, the messages that society and contemporary culture give out about what constitutes human worth, as well as human dignity, and how not only should family and friends respond to the suffering of the terminally ill, but also how the terminally ill might be led to respond to the perceived suffering and long suffering of family and friends. As the principal here said in his sermon on Sunday, in matters of this consequence, there is no individual wish or choice which is merely our own, The choices we make shape the choices and wishes that are available for others. It is then vital that lawmakers focus on the impact of any particular piece of legislation on the whole of society, and not just on the hard cases presented by one group, especially when the defining of that group is not always as clear as it at first sight might seem. For example, what about degenerative diseases that are not terminal, except in the long term? But it is here precisely the long-term nature of the suffering and the impact on those closest to them that is the central issue. Similarly, with cases of dementia, the level of suffering as it becomes acute is extremely difficult to compute. And with the paradox that the safeguards proposed in almost every piece of draft legislation to date would require those that seek such assistance in ending their own life to demonstrate unimpaired mental capacity, and so would preclude a whole class of individuals, whatever the perceived level of stress and suffering. The slogan most commonly used in connection with campaigns to secure the legislation of physician-assisted suicide is dignity in dying. But the principles with which I began must ensure that this is linked to dignity in living. Issues of assisted dying and assisted living are interrelated. There are currently great inequalities in mental and physical health conditions and provisions across our society, and these are linked to inequalities in housing, education, employment opportunity, access to medical and social care, and such differences are particularly marked across different ethnic groups. So two further legislative issues arise. The first relates to such safeguards as may be written into legislation to protect those whose life experience has been one of less choice and greater vulnerability to the pressure of others, particularly those to whom have become accustomed to look to others for important decisions about their lives. Second is about setting this debate in a wider context and asserting the moral priority of addressing issues of dignity in living. The acute social, cultural, and economic issues impacting on health, physical and mental, and social care, and the communities impacted differentially. It is right to ask, where is the involvement of these differentially affected groups in this debate, where the case for assisted suicide can appear to be pushed by a largely affluent and white middle class who in life have enjoyed the dignity of good health, housing, education, and employment, and the attendant benefit of choice. Now, over a long period of civic and parliamentary engagement, among the principles to which I've sought to be consistently committed is the one of responsible caution. It is part of the function of a scrutinizing chamber such as the House of Lords to be alert for and take precautionary action to mitigate the dangers of hidden elephant traps, the unforeseen consequences of well-meaning but poorly drafted legislation, and their potential impact on individuals, particularly the weakest, and the cohesion of wider society, its practices and norms. Thank you.